Close your eyes, if you will, and forget about time. Let your mind drift backward through the centuries, away from the rushing noise of our modern world, into an age where honour was measured not in wealth or fame, but in the precise arc of a blade through morning mist. Tonight, we journey through 1,500 years of Japanese history, through the rise and fall of a warrior class that would define a nation's soul, the samurai. Even the word carries weight, doesn't it? Yet how many truly understand the vast tapestry of human ambition, tragedy, and transformation that this simple term encompasses? Tonight, we'll walk with ghosts through bamboo forests and ancient battlefields, witness the birth of legends and the death of traditions, and discover that the story of the samurai is far stranger and more human than any Hollywood film could capture. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare yourself for a tale that spans the better part of 2 millennia. From the misty mountains of ancient Japan to the final moments of an entire way of life, this is the story of warriors who became poets, poets who became warriors, and the eternal dance between power and principle that shaped the land of the rising sun. Let us begin, as all the best stories do, in a time when the world was very different indeed. The year is 794, and in the imperial capital of Heian-kyo, now known as Kyoto, the Emperor Kamu has just made a decision that will echo through the centuries. He's tired of the Buddhist monks meddling in politics, weary of the corruption that has seeped into his court like water through cracked stone. So he moves his capital, creates new laws, and unwittingly sets in motion the forces that will give birth to the most famous warrior class in human history. But the samurai did not spring into existence fully formed, like some mythical creature emerging from the morning fog. Their story begins not with dramatic battles or legendary duels, but with the rather mundane problems of tax collection and frontier security. You see, the Heian court, for all its poetry and refined culture, had a persistent problem with what we might today call administrative oversight. The vast rice paddies of eastern Japan, the lifeblood of the imperial economy, were proving difficult to manage from the distant capital. Local officials, sent from Kyoto to collect taxes and maintain order, found themselves increasingly at the mercy of regional strongmen who had grown tired of sending their wealth westward to fund court ceremonies and elaborate temples. These local strongmen needed protection, and protection required soldiers. At first, these soldiers were hardly what we would recognize as samurai. They were farmers who could handle a sword, hunters who understood the value of discipline, younger sons of noble families seeking their fortunes in the borderlands. They called themselves bushi, or simply warriors, and they served whoever could pay them or offer them land. There was nothing particularly noble about their calling, nothing that suggested they would one day embody an entire philosophy of honour and duty. The irony of it all is delicious, really. The imperial court, in its pursuit of cultural refinement and Buddhist enlightenment, had created a system so focused on aesthetic perfection that it forgot the basic requirements of governance. While nobles in Kyoto debated the proper number of layers in a court lady's kimono, bandits roamed the countryside, and tax collectors required armed escorts to do their jobs. It was in this vacuum of practical authority that the first true samurai families began to emerge. The Minamoto clan, the Taira clan, the Fujiwara, names that would become synonymous with power and tragedy in the centuries to come. These families discovered something that the court poets had somehow missed, that real power comes not from proximity to the emperor, but from the to protect people's rice fields and keep the trade routes clear. By the 10th century, these provincial warriors had begun to develop their own culture, distinct from the refined atmosphere of the capital. They valued martial skill over literary accomplishment, loyalty over eloquence, and action over contemplation. They were, in many ways, the antithesis of everything the Heian court represented, which makes their eventual dominance over that very court all the more remarkable. The first recorded use of the term samurai appears in documents from this period, derived from the verb saburo, meaning to serve. But serve whom? Initially, these warriors served whoever could offer them the best opportunity for advancement. They were pragmatists, not idealists, and their loyalties shifted with the political winds. The romantic notion of the samurai as an unwavering exemplar of feudal loyalty would come much later, polished and perfected by centuries of myth-making. What these early warriors lacked in romantic idealism, they more than made up for in practical effectiveness. They developed new fighting techniques suited to the open spaces of eastern Japan, quite different from the ceremonial combat that occasionally took place near the capital. They learned to fight on horseback with devastating efficiency, perfected the use of the curved sword that would become synonymous with their class, and most importantly, they learned to work together in organised military units. The court in Kyoto initially viewed these provincial warriors with a mixture of disdain and nervous amusement. They were useful for handling unpleasant necessities like suppressing peasant revolts or dealing with raiders from the northern territories, but they certainly weren't the sort of people one would invite to a poetry reading. This attitude would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. In 935, a local warlord named Taira no Masakado decided that he was tired of taking orders from officials appointed by the distant court. He declared himself emperor of a new state in eastern Japan, gathered an army of similarly disaffected warriors, and proceeded to demonstrate just how little real power the imperial government possessed outside of its ceremonial sphere. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but not before it had sent shockwaves through the established order. The Masakado rebellion was a preview of coming attractions, a warning sign that the traditional power structure was becoming increasingly unstable. The court had created a warrior class to solve its administrative problems, but in doing so it had armed and organised the very forces that would eventually make it irrelevant. The students, as they so often do, would eventually surpass their teachers. As the 11th century progressed, the lines between court noble and provincial warrior began to blur in fascinating ways. Younger sons of great families, finding no place for themselves in the rigid hierarchy of Kyoto, sought their fortunes in the east. They married into warrior families, adopted warrior customs, and brought with them the education and cultural sophistication of the capital. This fusion of court refinement and martial prowess would become one of the defining characteristics of the mature samurai class. Meanwhile, in the capital itself, the great families began to realize that their elaborate political games required the backing of real military force. The Fujiwara clan, masters of court intrigue for generations, found themselves increasingly dependent on their relationships with warrior families. The marriage alliances that had once been purely political now carried military implications as well. It was during this period that the first great samurai legends began to take shape. Stories of warrior monks defending mountain temples, of horse archers who could split an arrow in flight, of swordsmen who could cut through iron. These tales, told and retold around cooking fires and in village sake houses, began to create a mythology around the warrior class that would prove far more durable than any actual political arrangement. The most famous of these early legends centers around a warrior named Minamoto no Yorimitsu, known to his contemporaries as Raiko. According to the stories that grew up around him, Raiko and his 4 faithful retainers, known as the 4 Heavenly Kings, battled demons and monsters throughout the Japanese countryside. They slew the great spider demon of Mount Yu, defeated the giant Oni-Shuten Doji, and purified the land of supernatural threats. Of course, the demons in these stories were almost certainly human bandits, and the monsters were probably just particularly troublesome local strongmen. But the important thing was not the literal truth of these tales, but the way they began to transform the public perception of the warrior class. Warriors were no longer just hired muscle for tax collection. They were protectors of the realm, guardians against chaos, servants of cosmic order. This mythologizing process accelerated throughout the 11th century, as the warrior families themselves began to adopt and promote these heroic narratives. They commissioned poets to write epic tales of their ancestors' deeds, sponsored travelling storytellers who would spread these legends to new audiences, and most cleverly of all, they began to live up to the myths they had created. The warrior code that would eventually be formalized as Bushido was already taking shape during this period, though it remained largely unwritten and varied considerably from family to family. The core elements were emerging: loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, skill with weapons, and a certain aesthetic sensibility that valued death before dishonour. These principles would be refined and codified over the following centuries, but their essential outlines were already visible in the 11th century. By 1050, the great warrior families had grown so powerful that they could no longer be ignored by the court. The Minamoto and Taira clans in particular had accumulated vast land holdings, private armies, and networks of allied families throughout eastern and western Japan. They had their own administrative systems, their own sources of revenue, and most dangerously of all, their own sense of legitimacy that owed nothing to imperial appointment. The court, recognizing the threat but unable to effectively counter it, attempted to co-opt these warrior families by granting them official positions and titles. The most successful warriors were invited to Kyoto, given ranks in the imperial hierarchy, and encouraged to participate in court ceremonies. This strategy worked after a fashion, but it also had the unintended consequence of educating the warrior class in the very political mechanisms they would eventually use to replace the court entirely. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform Japan forever. The court nobility, with their thousands of years of political experience but their atrophied military capabilities, faced off against the warrior families, with their modern military organisation but their relative inexperience in large-scale political management. The outcome of this struggle would determine not just who ruled Japan, but what kind of country Japan would become. The first phase of this confrontation came in 1156, in an event known to history as the Hogan Rebellion. On the surface, it appeared to be just another succession dispute of the sort that had plagued the imperial court for centuries. The retired Emperor Toba had died, leaving behind a complicated web of competing claims to imperial authority. Different factions of court nobles rallied behind different candidates, and as had become customary, they hired warrior families to provide military support. But this time was different. The warriors who marched into Kyoto in 1156 were not mere hired swords. They were the heads of vast military networks with their own political agendas. When the fighting was over, and the succession settled, it became clear that the real winners were not any of the imperial candidates, but the warrior families who had decided the issue with their swords. 4 years later, in 1160, the tension between the court and the warriors erupted again in the Heiji Rebellion. This time, the pretense of fighting for competing imperial factions was largely abandoned. The Taira clan, led by the formidable Taira no Kiyomori, decisively defeated their Minamoto rivals and established themselves as the effective rulers of Japan. The court continued to exist, continued to perform its ceremonies and conduct its poetry competitions, but real power had shifted irrevocably into the hands of the warriors. Kiyomori was an interesting figure, in many ways the first true samurai politician. He understood that military force alone was not sufficient to rule a complex society like Japan. He maintained the forms and ceremonies of court life, married his daughters into the imperial family, and carefully preserved the appearance of imperial authority, while exercising real power behind the scenes. He was, in effect, the prototype for all the shoguns who would follow him. But Kiyomori made one crucial mistake, a mistake that would cost his family everything and set the stage for the most famous war in Japanese history. In his moment of victory over the Minamoto clan, he chose mercy over thorough elimination. He spared the lives of his defeated rivals' children, sending them into exile rather than ending their bloodlines forever. It was a decision that perhaps spoke well of his character, but poorly of his political judgment. Among those spared children was a boy named Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would grow up in exile dreaming of revenge. Another was his younger brother Yoshitsune, who would become perhaps the most famous warrior in Japanese history. These boys, raised far from the comforts of court life, would develop into the kind of hardened, ruthless fighters that Kiyomori himself could never quite become. The 20 years of Taira dominance that followed represent a fascinating transitional period in Japanese history. Kiyomori and his clan attempted to rule as warrior nobles, maintaining their military edge while adopting the cultural sophistication of the court. They built magnificent palaces, patronized artists and poets, and tried to create a synthesis of martial and cultural values that would satisfy both their warrior followers and their aristocratic subjects. In many ways, they succeeded. The 1170s were a period of relative peace and prosperity, with trade flourishing and the arts reaching new heights of refinement. Kiyomori himself became one of the most powerful men in East Asia, conducting diplomatic relations with Song dynasty China and accumulating wealth that dwarfed even that of the imperial family. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Taira had solved the fundamental problem of warrior rule, how to maintain military effectiveness while providing effective governance. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. The warrior families who had supported the Taira expected to be rewarded with land and positions, but many of these rewards came at the expense of other warrior families who began to feel excluded from the new order. The monks of the great temple complexes, long accustomed to political influence, chafed under warrior rule and began to organize their own military forces. Most dangerously of all, the exiled Minamoto boys were growing up and beginning to attract followers who remembered the old clan's former glory. Kiyomori, perhaps sensing the growing instability, made increasingly desperate attempts to secure his family's position. He moved the imperial capital away from Kyoto to a location more easily defended by his forces. He arranged marriages between his family and the imperial line with almost unseemly haste. He began to eliminate potential rivals with a ruthlessness that contrasted sharply with his earlier mercy. But all of these measures only served to increase the opposition to his rule. The end began in 1180, when Prince Mochihito, a son of the retired emperor who had been passed over for the succession, issued a call for the overthrow of the Taira clan. The prince himself was quickly captured and eliminated, but his message had already spread throughout the country, reaching the ears of every discontented warrior family and ambitious monastery. Most importantly, it reached the now-adult Minamoto no Yoritomo in his place of exile. What followed was not a single great battle, but a 5-year campaign of almost unprecedented complexity and violence, known to history as the Genpei War. It was a conflict that would destroy the old order completely and establish the foundation for 7 centuries of warrior rule. It would also produce some of the most enduring legends in Japanese culture, stories that continue to be told and retold to this day. The genius of Yoritomo lay not in his military skills, which were competent but hardly exceptional, but in his ability to transform what might have been a simple revenge campaign into a broad coalition against Taira rule. He understood that military victory alone would not be sufficient. He needed to create a new form of government that could command the loyalty of warrior families throughout Japan, while maintaining enough legitimacy to govern effectively. From his base in Kamakura, far from the traditional centres of power in Kyoto and Nara, Yoritomo began to construct what was essentially a parallel government. He appointed his own officials, established his own courts, and most importantly, created his own system for granting and confirming land rights. Warrior families who had chafed under Taira rule began to defect to his cause, not just because they opposed Kiyomori, but because Yoritomo offered them something the Taira could not: a system of governance designed by and for warriors. Meanwhile, the actual fighting was being conducted primarily by Yoritomo's remarkable younger brother, Yoshitsune. If Yoritomo was the political genius of the Minamoto cause, Yoshitsune was its military heart and soul. Trained from childhood in the arts of war, possessed of an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in his followers, Yoshitsune fought with a combination of tactical brilliance and personal courage that quickly made him a legend even among his enemies. The war's most famous battles were largely Yoshitsune's battles. At Ichi no Tani, he led a cavalry charge down a cliff so steep that it was considered impassable, routing a much larger Taira force through sheer audacity. At Yashima, he conducted an amphibious assault that caught the enemy completely off guard, demonstrating the kind of innovative thinking that would become a hallmark of samurai warfare. But it was at Dan-no-Ura, in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu, that Yoshitsune achieved his greatest and most terrible victory. The final battle of the Genpei War was fought largely at sea, with both sides using a combination of archery and boarding actions to try to gain the advantage. For most of the day, the battle hung in the balance, with the Taira's superior seamanship offsetting the Minamoto's advantages in numbers and morale. The turning point came when several Taira allies switched sides in the middle of the battle, a betrayal that left the Taira fleet exposed and outnumbered. Rather than face capture and the inevitable consequences, the surviving members of the Taira leadership chose to end their lives by drowning. The 8-year-old Emperor Antoku, the grandson of Kiyomori, was carried into the waves by his grandmother, along with the sacred mirror that was one of the 3 imperial regalia. The Battle of Dan-no-Ura was not just a military victory, it was a cultural catastrophe that marked the end of an entire way of life. The Taira clan, with their attempt to synthesize warrior and courtly values, had represented one possible future for Japan. Their destruction at Dan-no-Ura ensured that Japan would develop along very different lines, under the leadership of warriors who had little interest in maintaining the old courtly traditions. Yoshitsune's moment of triumph, however, was also the beginning of his tragedy. His very success had made him a threat to his brother's carefully constructed political arrangements. Yoritomo, perhaps fearing that Yoshitsune's military reputation would overshadow his own political authority, began to treat his brother with increasing suspicion and hostility. The hero of the Genpei War found himself increasingly isolated, eventually forced to flee from the very government he had helped to establish. The story of Yoshitsune's flight and eventual death has become one of the most beloved tragic tales in Japanese literature. Betrayed by allies, hunted by his own brother's forces, he finally made his last stand at Koromogawa in the far north of Honshu. When defeat became inevitable, he took his own life in the manner that would become the ultimate expression of samurai honor, seppuku, ritual disembowelment that demonstrated one's willingness to choose death over dishonor. Yet even in death, Yoshitsune's legend continued to grow. Folktales claim that he had escaped to the northern island of Hokkaido, where he lived among the Ainu people and eventually made his way to Mongolia, where he became the great conqueror Genghis Khan. These stories, fantastic as they were, reflected the Japanese people's reluctance to believe that such a hero could truly die, their need to imagine that somewhere, somehow, Yoshitsune continued to embody the ideal of the perfect warrior. With Yoshitsune dead and his rivals eliminated, Yoritomo was free to create the new form of government he had been planning throughout the war years. In 1192, he received from the emperor the title of Sei-Itai Shogun, literally barbarian subduing generalissimo, a military rank that carried with it the authority to govern in the emperor's name. Thus was born the institution of the shogunate, which would dominate Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries. The Kamakura shogunate, as historians call Yoritomo's government, represented a revolutionary departure from previous forms of Japanese rule. Unlike the court nobility, who governed through elaborate ceremonies and complex bureaucratic procedures, the shogunate ruled through a relatively simple system based on personal loyalty and military obligation. Warrior families throughout Japan swore allegiance to the shogun in Kamakura, and in return received grants of land and the right to govern their territories as they saw fit, so long as they provided military service when called upon. This system, which historians call feudalism, had several advantages over the previous arrangement. It was more efficient since decisions could be made quickly by military commanders rather than being debated endlessly by court committees. It was more responsive to local conditions, since the actual governors were drawn from the regions they governed rather than being appointed from the distant capital. And it was more stable since it was based on mutual self-interest rather than abstract political theory. But the new system also had its weaknesses, as became apparent almost immediately after Yoritomo's death in 1199. The shogun had been the personal focal point for the loyalty of warrior families throughout Japan, but he had failed to create institutions that could function effectively without his direct supervision. His sons lacked his political skills and military reputation, and the coalition he had built began to fracture almost immediately. Real power in the Kamakura government passed to the Hojo family, who had been Yoritomo's most important allies and were related to him through marriage. The Hojo ruled not as shoguns themselves, but as regents for a series of increasingly powerless Minamoto shoguns, and later for imperial princes who were appointed to the position but held no real authority. This system of indirect rule, with the real rulers governing in the name of titular authorities, who themselves ruled in the name of an emperor who possessed no actual power, became characteristic of Japanese politics for centuries to come. Despite these political complications, the early 13th century was a period of remarkable cultural flowering. The warrior class, having achieved political dominance, began to develop its own distinctive forms of artistic expression. The great military epics like the Tale of the Heike were composed during this period, preserving for posterity the stories of the Genpei War and establishing the literary archetypes that would define the samurai in the popular imagination. These epic tales did more than simply record historical events. They transformed those events into moral instruction for future generations of warriors. The Heike Monogatari, in particular, presented the Genpei War as a cosmic drama, in which the forces of order and chaos battled for control of the universe. The Taira were portrayed not as political rivals, but as representatives of an older, more refined age that had lost touch with the fundamental realities of power. The Minamoto, by contrast, represented the new age of warrior rule, characterized by practical wisdom and moral clarity. But these literary works also introduced a note of melancholy that would become central to the samurai worldview. The very title of the Heike Monogatari begins with a meditation on the impermanence of all earthly glory, and the work is suffused with Buddhist concepts of karma and the inevitability of suffering. This combination of martial valor and philosophical resignation would become one of the defining characteristics of samurai culture. The Kamakura period also saw the introduction of Zen Buddhism to Japan, a development that would have profound implications for the samurai class. Unlike the esoteric Buddhism of the Heian court, which emphasized elaborate rituals and complex theological speculation, Zen focused on direct personal experience and practical wisdom. Its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and the cultivation of mental clarity appealed strongly to warriors who valued practical results over abstract theorizing. Zen monasteries became important centers of education for young samurai, providing not only religious instruction, but also training in poetry, painting, and the other cultural arts that were becoming increasingly important markers of social status. The synthesis of martial and aesthetic values that had been attempted unsuccessfully by the Taira finally achieved full expression in the Zen-influenced samurai culture of the Kamakura period. This cultural development was put to the test in the 1270s, when Japan faced its first serious external threat in centuries. Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China, sent envoys to Japan demanding tribute and submission. When these demands were rejected, he launched two massive invasion attempts, in 1274 and 1281, that brought the largest military forces in world history to the shores of Kyushu. The Mongol invasions were a catastrophe that nearly destroyed the Kamakura government, not because of military defeat, but because of their enormous cost and the government's inability to reward the warriors who had defended the country. Unlike previous conflicts, which had resulted in the conquest of enemy territory that could be redistributed to loyal followers, the Mongol invasions produced no new lands to grant. The samurai who had fought bravely against the invaders found themselves impoverished by the effort, while the government found itself unable to meet its obligations to them. The invasions also revealed significant weaknesses in the traditional samurai approach to warfare. The individual combat and cavalry charges that had proven so effective in the Genpei War were largely useless against the Mongol formations, which fought as disciplined infantry units supported by primitive firearms and explosive weapons. Many samurai found themselves having to adapt to new forms of warfare that emphasized group tactics over individual heroism, a development that would have important implications for the future evolution of their class. But the most significant effect of the Mongol invasions was psychological. For the first time in centuries, Japan had faced the possibility of foreign conquest, and the experience left deep scars on the national consciousness. The conviction that Japan was protected by divine forces, a belief seemingly confirmed by the typhoons that destroyed both Mongol fleets, became a central element of Japanese identity. The samurai, as the defenders of this sacred land, gained a quasi-religious status that would profoundly influence their role in Japanese society. The financial strain of the invasions, combined with the long-term effects of the feudal system's inherent instabilities, gradually undermined the Kamakura government's effectiveness. By the early 14th century, the shogunate was struggling with peasant revolts, samurai uprisings, and the growing power of religious institutions. The final blow came in 1333, when the Emperor Go-Daigo launched a restoration movement aimed at returning real political power to the imperial court. The Kemu Restoration, as this movement was called, initially appeared successful. Go-Daigo's forces, aided by defecting Kamakura generals, captured the shogunal capital and brought the Hojo regency to an end. For a brief period, it seemed as though Japan might return to the direct imperial rule of the Heian period. But the emperor's efforts to turn back the clock of history proved futile. The warrior families who had supported his restoration had no intention of giving up their own political and economic power. Within 3 years, a new shogunate had been established by the Ashikaga family, but this time the political situation was far more complex. The Ashikaga shoguns ruled from Kyoto, placing them in direct competition with the imperial court for prestige and authority. Different branches of the imperial family established rival courts, each claiming to be the legitimate government of Japan. The country effectively split into 2 rival political systems, each controlling different parts of the archipelago. This period, known as the Northern and Southern Courts era, represents one of the most chaotic periods in Japanese history. For over 50 years, from 1336 to 1392, Japan was effectively a country divided against itself, with rival emperors, rival shoguns, and countless local conflicts that shifted alliance and fortune with bewildering rapidity. It was during this period that the samurai class truly came into its own as an independent political force, no longer dependent on either imperial or shogunal authority for legitimacy. The breakdown of central authority had paradoxical effects on samurai culture. On one hand, the constant warfare of the period led to a coarsening of warrior values with pragmatic considerations often overriding traditional concepts of honour and loyalty. On the other hand, the very instability of the period led to a nostalgic idealization of earlier, supposedly more pure forms of samurai behaviour. It was during the 14th century that many of the classic texts on warrior ethics were composed, as thoughtful samurai attempted to codify and preserve what they saw as the essential values of their class. The most famous of these texts, the Heike Monogatari and the Taiheki, presented somewhat different visions of ideal samurai behaviour. The Heike emphasised loyalty, courage and aesthetic sensibility, while the Taiheki focused more on practical wisdom and political acumen. These different emphases reflected the complex reality of 14th century samurai life, in which warriors had to balance military obligations with administrative responsibilities, personal honour with family survival, and traditional values with the demands of a rapidly changing society. The long period of civil war finally came to an end in 1392, when the Ashikaga shogun Yoshimitsu succeeded in reunifying the rival courts under his authority. But the reunification was more apparent than real. The central government had been so weakened by decades of conflict that it could exercise only nominal control over much of the country. Real power lay with the daimyo, regional lords who ruled their territories as independent kingdoms while paying lip service to the shogun in Kyoto. This decentralization of authority had profound effects on the development of samurai culture. Each domain developed its own military traditions, its own artistic styles, and its own interpretation of samurai values. The result was an extraordinarily rich and diverse warrior culture, but one that lacked the unity and coherence of earlier periods. The samurai class was becoming not a single entity, but a collection of regional military aristocracies, each with its own character and priorities. The 15th century saw the gradual breakdown of even the nominal authority of the Ashikaga shogunate. The Onin War, which began in 1467 as a succession dispute within the shogunal family, escalated into a general conflict that devastated the capital and effectively ended central government in Japan. For the next century and a half, the country would be ruled by a constantly shifting alliance of regional daimyo, each seeking to expand his territory at the expense of his neighbours. This period, known as the Sengoku or Warring States era, represents the ultimate expression of samurai military culture. With no effective central authority to restrain them, the daimyo were free to pursue their ambitions through constant warfare. Armies grew larger, weapons became more sophisticated, and military tactics evolved rapidly as commanders sought any advantage over their rivals. It was an age of military innovation and political experimentation, but also of almost unimaginable violence and social disruption. The constant warfare of the Sengoku period produced some of the most famous figures in Japanese history. There was Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, whose cavalry charges became legendary throughout Japan. There was Usugi Kenshin, the Dragon of Echigo, who fought Takeda in a series of epic battles that seemed to embody the very essence of samurai warfare. There was Date Masamune, the One-Eyed Dragon, whose distinctive armour and tactical brilliance made him a figure of fear and admiration throughout the north. But perhaps the most remarkable figure of the age was a man who embodied all the contradictions and possibilities of the Sengoku period, Oda Nobunaga, the would-be unifier of Japan. Nobunaga was in many ways the antithesis of the traditional samurai ideal. He showed little respect for established customs or religious institutions, was ruthlessly pragmatic in his choice of allies and enemies, and was willing to use any weapon or tactic that gave him an advantage, regardless of its effects on civilian populations. Yet Nobunaga was also unquestionably a great military genius, whose innovations in warfare and administration laid the foundation for Japan's eventual reunification. He was among the first Japanese commanders to make extensive use of firearms, which had been introduced by Portuguese traders in the 1540s. He reorganised his armies along more professional lines, reducing the importance of individual heroism in favour of disciplined unit tactics. Most importantly, he understood that military conquest alone was not sufficient for lasting political control. It had to be combined with effective economic and administrative policies. Nobunaga's career illustrates one of the central themes of the Sengoku period, the tension between innovation and tradition within samurai culture. The warriors of this era were forced to adapt to rapidly changing military technology and political circumstances, but they also remained deeply attached to the values and customs that defined their class identity. The result was a complex synthesis of old and new, in which traditional samurai ideals were preserved but given new forms of expression. The firearms that played such an important role in Nobunaga's military success, for example, were initially viewed with suspicion by many samurai, who saw them as somehow dishonourable weapons that reduced the importance of individual skill and courage. But within a generation, these same weapons had been integrated into samurai military culture, with elaborate ceremonies developing around their use and maintenance. The samurai proved remarkably adaptable, able to absorb new technologies and techniques while maintaining their essential character as a warrior class. Nobunaga's unification campaign came to an abrupt end in 1582, when he was betrayed and forced to commit seppuku by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. But his work was continued by his most capable subordinate, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man whose rise to power represents one of the most remarkable stories in Japanese history. Hideyoshi had been born a peasant, the son of a foot soldier in Nobunaga's army, but through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and extraordinary personal charisma, he had risen to become one of his lord's most trusted commanders. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi moved quickly to consolidate his position, defeating his rivals and establishing himself as the effective ruler of central Japan. He then embarked on a series of campaigns that brought the entire country under his control, completing the unification that Nobunaga had begun. But Hideyoshi's unification was different from anything that had come before. He created not just a military alliance, but a new form of government that would prove remarkably durable. The key to Hideyoshi's success lay in his understanding of the relationship between military and social organization. He realized that the chronic instability of the Sengoku period was largely due to the fluid nature of social boundaries, which allowed peasants to become warriors and warriors to become farmers depending on circumstances. To create lasting peace, he instituted a series of reforms that rigidly separated the social classes and froze them in place. The most important of these reforms was the separation of warriors and farmers, which required all samurai to live in castle towns, under the direct supervision of their daimyo lords, while forbidding farmers from bearing arms or leaving their villages without permission. This policy effectively ended the tradition of the peasant warrior that had been so important during the earlier periods of samurai history, but it also created the conditions for the long period of peace that would follow. Hideyoshi's social reforms were accompanied by economic and administrative changes that further strengthened central authority. He conducted a comprehensive land survey that established uniform standards for taxation throughout the country. He standardized weights, measures, and currency, facilitating trade and economic development. He even issued sumptuary laws that regulated what kinds of clothing and luxuries people of different social classes were allowed to possess. These reforms created the foundation for what would become the Tokugawa system, but Hideyoshi himself would not live to see its full implementation. His later years were marked by an increasingly megalomaniacal attempt to extend Japanese power beyond the archipelago itself. In 1592, and again in 1597, he launched massive invasions of Korea, ostensibly as the first step in a campaign to conquer China itself. These invasions were military disasters that drained Japan's resources and created lasting hostility with its continental neighbours, but they also demonstrated the extent to which Japanese military power had developed during the Sengoku period. Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving behind a 5-year-old heir and a complex system of regents and advisors intended to preserve Toyotomi power until the child came of age. But the system he had created was ultimately dependent on his personal authority, and without his unifying presence, the coalition of daimyo that supported his family began to fracture. The stage was set for one final round of warfare that would determine the future of Japan. The man who would emerge victorious from this final struggle was Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of Hideyoshi's most powerful and patient allies. Ieyasu was in many ways the ideal Sengoku daimyo, militarily competent, politically astute, and blessed with an almost supernatural ability to choose the winning side in any conflict. He had served under both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, learning from their successes and failures while carefully building his own power base in eastern Japan. When the inevitable succession crisis erupted after Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu positioned himself as the defender of stable government against the ambitions of other daimyo who sought to exploit the situation for their own benefit. At the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, he led a coalition of eastern daimyo against a rival coalition of western lords, winning a victory so decisive that it effectively ended the Sengoku period and established his family as the undisputed rulers of Japan. But Ieyasu's victory was more than just another military success in the endless cycle of Sengoku warfare. It represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Japanese government and society. Unlike his predecessors, who had ruled through personal charisma and military force, Ieyasu created institutional structures that could function effectively without constant supervision. The Tokugawa shogunate would prove to be one of the most stable and long-lasting governments in world history. The key to Tokugawa stability lay in a complex system of checks and balances that prevented any single daimyo or group of daimyo from accumulating enough power to challenge shogunal authority. The country was divided into several hundred domains, each ruled by a daimyo who possessed considerable autonomy within his own territory, but was subject to strict supervision by the central government. The daimyo were required to spend alternate years in the shogunal capital of Edo, modern Tokyo, leaving their families there as hostages when they returned to their domains. This system, known as Sankin Kotai or alternate attendance, served multiple purposes beyond simple political control. It created a massive flow of people and goods between the domains and the capital, stimulating economic development and cultural exchange. It encouraged the development of a common national culture, as daimyo from different regions interacted with each other and with the sophisticated urban culture of Edo. And it transformed the samurai class itself, as warriors who had once been primarily concerned with military matters became involved in the complex administrative and economic tasks required to manage the system. The early decades of Tokugawa rule saw the final crystallization of samurai culture into the form it would maintain for the next 2.5 centuries. Cut off from their traditional military function by the peace that the new government had established, the samurai class gradually transformed itself into a hereditary bureaucracy. They retained their exclusive right to bear swords and their privileged position in the social hierarchy, but their daily lives became increasingly focused on administrative rather than military duties. This transformation was not without its costs. Many samurai struggled to adapt to their new circumstances, finding it difficult to maintain their traditional values and sense of purpose in a world that no longer required their military services. The warrior ideals that had been forged in centuries of warfare seemed increasingly irrelevant in an age of peace and prosperity. Some samurai turned to scholarship or the arts, finding new ways to express their traditional values, while others became increasingly nostalgic for an imagined golden age of pure warrior virtue. It was during this period that the formal code of Bushido was finally articulated in its classic form. Works like Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure and the anonymous Bukeshohato presented systematic accounts of samurai ethics and behaviour, attempting to preserve and codify the warrior values that seemed threatened by the new peaceful order. These texts emphasized loyalty, courage, honour, and ritual correctness as the essential virtues of the samurai class, creating an idealized vision of warrior behaviour that often had little relation to the complex realities of actual samurai life. The irony of this development is striking. The most famous and influential statements of samurai ideals were written during a period when the samurai class was becoming increasingly divorced from its military origins. The Bushido of the Tokugawa period was as much a product of nostalgia and wishful thinking as it was of actual warrior experience. Yet these idealized visions of samurai behavior would prove remarkably durable, influencing Japanese culture long after the samurai class itself had disappeared. Meanwhile, Japanese society as a whole was undergoing profound changes that would have far-reaching implications for the future of the samurai class. The peace and stability of Tokugawa rule allowed for unprecedented economic development, with the growth of cities, the expansion of trade, and the emergence of a sophisticated commercial culture. The merchant class, which had traditionally been ranked below even farmers in the official social hierarchy, began to accumulate wealth and influence that far exceeded that of many samurai families. This economic development created new challenges for the samurai class, which found itself increasingly squeezed between its traditional aristocratic pretensions and its actual economic circumstances. Many samurai families, dependent on fixed stipends from their daimyo lords, found it difficult to maintain their lifestyle in the face of inflation and rising prices. Some turned to commercial activities to supplement their incomes, despite the official prohibition on samurai engaging in trade. Others simply fell into genteel poverty, maintaining the outward forms of their status while struggling to make ends meet. The most talented and adaptable members of the samurai class found new roles as scholars, teachers, and cultural leaders. The Tokugawa government actively promoted education and scholarship, seeing them as necessary for effective administration, and samurai were well positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. Many became students of Chinese philosophy and literature, while others turned to practical subjects like medicine, engineering, and agriculture. Some even became interested in Western learning, despite the government's policy of limiting contact with foreign countries. This intellectual development had important implications for the future of the samurai class and Japanese society as a whole. Educated samurai began to develop new ideas about government, society, and Japan's place in the world. Some became advocates of political reform, arguing that the Tokugawa system was too rigid and conservative to meet the challenges of a changing world. Others became students of military science, maintaining the warrior traditions of their class while adapting them to new circumstances and technologies. Perhaps the most remarkable figure of this intellectual awakening was Miyamoto Musashi, whose life spanned the transition from the chaotic warfare of the Sengoku period to the ordered peace of the early Tokugawa era. Musashi was a ronin, a masterless samurai who had survived the fall of his lord's house and was forced to make his own way in the world. He became the most famous swordsman in Japanese history, claiming to have fought over 60 duels without ever suffering defeat. But Musashi was far more than just a skilled fighter. He was also a profound thinker about the nature of combat and strategy. His book, The Book of Five Rings, is one of the most sophisticated treatments of military strategy ever written, combining practical instruction in swordsmanship with philosophical meditation on the nature of conflict and the cultivation of mental discipline. Musashi understood that true mastery of the martial arts required not just physical skill, but also intellectual understanding and spiritual development. Musashi's life and teachings embodied many of the contradictions of samurai culture during the early Tokugawa period. He was a warrior in an age of peace, a wanderer in an age of social stability, an individualist in an age of rigid hierarchy. Yet he managed to transform these contradictions into a coherent philosophy that spoke to the deepest aspirations of the samurai class. His example showed that the warrior spirit could survive and even flourish in circumstances very different from those that had originally given birth to it. The most famous incident in Musashi's career was his duel with Sasaki Kojiro on the island of Ganryu in 1612. Kojiro was renowned for his skill with the nodachi, an extra-long sword that gave him a significant reach advantage in combat. He was also known for his technique called swallow cut, which was supposedly swift and precise enough to strike down a bird in flight. The duel between these two masters was seen as a contest between different schools of swordsmanship and different philosophies of combat. Musashi arrived late for the appointed duel, having spent the morning carving a wooden sword from an oar. This was a calculated insult to his opponent, suggesting that he was confident enough of victory to use an improvised weapon, rather than a proper steel blade. But it was also a practical choice. The wooden sword was longer than Kojiro's nodachi, negating his reach advantage. In the brief combat that followed, Musashi struck down his opponent with a single blow to the head, demonstrating the superiority of his two-sword technique and his unconventional approach to strategy. The duel at Ganryu became one of the most famous stories in Japanese culture, inspiring countless retellings in literature, theatre, and art. But its significance went beyond mere entertainment. It represented the triumph of innovation over tradition, of adaptive intelligence over rigid technique. Musashi's victory validated his belief that true mastery required not just adherence to established forms, but also the willingness to transcend those forms when circumstances demanded it. After his victory over Kojiro, Musashi gradually withdrew from active dueling and devoted himself to the development of his philosophy and teaching methods. He spent years in meditation and study developing his famous two-sword technique and writing the texts that would preserve his insights for future generations. He also became an accomplished artist, creating paintings and sculptures that demonstrated the same principles of simplicity and directness that characterized his approach to swordsmanship. Musashi's later years were spent in the service of the Hosokawa clan, where he served as a strategist and teacher rather than as an active warrior. This transition from fighter to thinker reflected the broader changes taking place within the samurai class during the early Tokugawa period. The skills that had made samurai effective warriors during the age of constant warfare had to be adapted to the requirements of peaceful administration and cultural leadership. The transformation of the samurai class accelerated throughout the 17th and 18th centuries as the memory of the Sengoku period faded and new generations of warriors grew up knowing only peace. The elaborate military rituals and ceremonies that had once had practical significance became increasingly formalized and abstract. The study of martial arts continued, but it became more of a spiritual discipline than a preparation for actual combat. This process of formalization had both positive and negative effects on samurai culture. On the positive side, it allowed for the development of highly sophisticated theories of strategy, ethics, and personal development that would influence Japanese culture for centuries. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry, and other cultural arts reached new heights of refinement under samurai patronage. The combination of martial and aesthetic values that had been struggling to emerge since the Heian period finally achieved full expression. On the negative side, the increasing distance from actual combat experience led to a certain artificiality and sterility in samurai culture. The warrior ideals that had been forged in the crucible of real warfare became increasingly abstract and theoretical. Some samurai began to compensate for this loss of practical relevance by developing an exaggerated code of honor that emphasized form over substance, leading to tragic incidents where warriors would commit seppuku over minor points of etiquette or perceived slights to their dignity. The classic example of this tendency was the incident of the 47 Ronin, which occurred in 1703 and became one of the most famous stories in Japanese culture. The incident began when a provincial daimyo named Asano Naganori was insulted by a court official named Kira Yoshinaka during a ceremony at the shogun's palace. Following the strict protocol of the Tokugawa court, Asano was forbidden from responding to the insult, but his anger eventually overcame his self-control and he drew his sword and wounded Kira. Drawing a weapon within the shogun's palace was a capital offence, and Asano was immediately ordered to commit seppuku. His domain was confiscated and his retainers became ronin, masterless samurai with no source of income or social position. According to the rigid code of loyalty that governed samurai behaviour, these retainers were obligated to avenge their lord's death, but doing so would place them in direct opposition to the shogunal government that had ordered his punishment. 47 of Asano's former retainers, led by his chief retainer Oishi Kuranosuke, spent nearly 2 years planning their revenge. They carefully studied Kira's habits and defences, dispersed to different parts of the country to avoid suspicion, and maintained the appearance of having abandoned their obligations to their dead lord. When they finally struck, on a snowy night in December 1702, they caught Kira's household completely off guard and succeeded in killing their target. Having accomplished their mission, the 47 Ronin faced a dilemma. They had fulfilled their obligation to their lord, but they had also committed murder and violated the peace that was one of the fundamental principles of Tokugawa rule. Some members of the government favoured pardoning them as loyal retainers who had simply done their duty, while others argued that they should be punished as criminals who had taken the law into their own hands. The debate that surrounded the fate of the 47 Ronin reflected deeper tensions within Tokugawa society about the role and relevance of traditional samurai values. In the end, the government reached a compromise that satisfied no one but preserved both the letter of the law and the principle of samurai honour. The Ronin were ordered to commit seppuku, but they were allowed to die as samurai rather than being executed as common criminals. The story of the 47 Ronin became immensely popular with the Japanese public, inspiring countless dramatic adaptations and literary treatments. It represented the perfect synthesis of loyalty, sacrifice, and tragic nobility that epitomized the samurai ideal in the popular imagination, but it also highlighted the increasing irrelevance of traditional samurai values in a world governed by bureaucratic procedures and commercial considerations rather than personal honour and martial prowess. As the 18th century progressed, the contradictions within samurai society became increasingly apparent. The class that had once been the undisputed masters of Japan found itself gradually marginalized by economic and social changes that it was powerless to control. The rise of the merchant class, the growth of cities, and the development of a money economy all worked to undermine the traditional basis of samurai power and prestige. Many samurai families found themselves deeply in debt to merchants and moneylenders, despite their theoretically superior social status. The fixed stipends that they received from their daimyo lords had not kept pace with inflation, while the merchants they looked down upon had grown wealthy through trade and commerce. Some samurai began to question whether the rigid social hierarchy of the Tokugawa system was really in their best interests, or whether some form of reform might be necessary to restore their fortunes. These economic pressures were compounded by intellectual challenges that came from both domestic and foreign sources. The study of Chinese philosophy and history led some samurai to question the legitimacy of the shogunal system, arguing that true loyalty required devotion to the emperor rather than to the Tokugawa family. The limited contact with Western learning that was permitted under the Tokugawa policy of national isolation introduced new ideas about government, science, and social organization that challenged traditional assumptions. The most serious challenge to the Tokugawa system came from an unexpected source: the arrival of American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. Perry's demand that Japan open itself to foreign trade and diplomatic relations exposed the military weakness of the shogunal government and demonstrated that the policy of national isolation was no longer sustainable in a world dominated by Western powers. The crisis precipitated by Perry's arrival divided the samurai class as it had not been divided since the Genpei War. Some samurai supported the shogun's decision to sign treaties with the Western powers, arguing that Japan needed time to modernize its military and administrative systems before it could effectively resist foreign pressure. Others advocated immediate resistance to foreign demands, regardless of the consequences, and called for a return to the traditional policy of isolation. The debate over foreign policy quickly became entangled with broader questions about the nature of political authority and the future direction of Japanese society. Anti-foreign sentiment became associated with loyalty to the emperor and opposition to the shogunal government, while support for opening the country became identified with pragmatic acceptance of Tokugawa rule. The samurai class found itself forced to choose between competing visions of Japan's future, each of which seemed to threaten some aspect of their traditional values and interests. The political crisis of the 1850s and 1860s, known as the Bakumatsu period, saw the emergence of a new generation of samurai activists who combined traditional loyalty with revolutionary political ideas. These young warriors, known as shishi or men of spirit, were willing to use violence to achieve their political goals, but they justified their actions in terms of the highest samurai ideals of loyalty and sacrifice for the greater good. The shishi movement produced some of the most remarkable figures in Japanese history, men who combined the martial traditions of their class with sophisticated political thinking and an almost mystical devotion to the imperial cause. They organized secret societies, planned assassinations of government officials, and eventually launched a full-scale rebellion against the Tokugawa shogunate that would culminate in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The Meiji Restoration was not simply a political revolution, it was also a cultural transformation that marked the end of the samurai as a distinct social class. The new government, led by a coalition of reform-minded samurai and court nobles, was committed to modernizing Japan along Western lines and creating a strong, centralized state capable of defending the country's independence. This process of modernization required the dismantling of the feudal system that had sustained the samurai class for over 7 centuries. The abolition of the Han system in 1871 eliminated the daimyo domains that had provided the political and economic foundation for samurai power. The establishment of a modern conscript army in 1873 ended the samurai's monopoly on military service and made their traditional martial skills largely obsolete. The prohibition on wearing swords in 1876 removed the most visible symbol of samurai status, while the commutation of samurai stipends into government bonds effectively ended their economic privileges. These reforms were implemented by the very samurai leaders who had brought the new government to power, a fact that demonstrates both the pragmatic wisdom and the tragic irony of the Meiji Restoration. The samurai had destroyed their own class in order to save their country, sacrificing their traditional privileges and identity for the greater good of national survival in a hostile international environment. Not all samurai accepted these changes willingly. The 1870s saw a series of samurai rebellions against the new government, culminating in the Great Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 led by Saigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Meiji Restoration. Saigo's rebellion was in many ways the last stand of the traditional samurai class, an attempt to preserve their ancient values and privileges through force of arms. The Satsuma Rebellion was crushed by the new imperial army, which used modern weapons and tactics against Saigo's traditionalist followers. The defeat and death of Saigo marked the definitive end of the samurai as a political and military force in Japanese society. The class that had dominated Japan for 7 centuries had been defeated by peasant conscripts, armed with Western rifles and trained in Western military techniques. Yet the death of the samurai as a social class did not mean the end of samurai influence on Japanese culture. Many of the leaders of the new Meiji government were former samurai who carried their traditional values and attitudes into their new roles as modernizing administrators. The emphasis on loyalty, discipline, and service to the state that characterized Meiji-era reforms reflected the continuing influence of samurai ideals, even as the class structure that had originally embodied those ideals was being dismantled. The transformation of samurai values in the modern period is perhaps best exemplified by the career of men like Fukuzawa Yukichi, a former samurai who became one of Japan's leading advocates of Western learning and democratic ideas. Fukuzawa argued that true loyalty to the emperor and the Japanese people required the adoption of Western science, technology, and political institutions, even if this meant abandoning traditional customs and social arrangements. This process of selective modernization, in which Western techniques were adopted while Japanese values were preserved, became known as Japanese spirit, Western learning, and remained a central theme in Japanese cultural development well into the 20th century. The samurai ideals of loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice were not abandoned, but were redirected toward new goals, building a modern industrial economy, creating a powerful military, and establishing Japan as a respected member of the international community. The success of this modernization effort can be measured by Japan's rapid rise to great power status in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The country that had been forced to sign unequal treaties with Western powers in the 1850s had become strong enough to defeat China in 1894 to 95 and Russia in 1904 to 1905, demonstrating that it had successfully absorbed and adapted Western military and industrial techniques while maintaining its cultural identity. But this success came at a cost. The samurai values that had been redirected toward modernization goals became increasingly militaristic and nationalistic, contributing to the aggressive expansionism that would eventually lead Japan into World War II. The ideal of loyalty to the emperor that had motivated the Meiji Restoration was transformed into a fanatical devotion to the state that brooked no opposition or dissent. The defeat of Japan in 1945 marked the final end of the influence of traditional samurai values on Japanese politics and society. The new democratic constitution imposed by the American occupation explicitly renounced war as an instrument of national policy and established popular sovereignty as the basis of political authority. The emperor was reduced to a purely symbolic role, while real power was vested in elected officials responsible to the people, rather than to any traditional source of authority. Yet even today, more than 150 years after the Meiji Restoration formally ended the samurai as a social class, their influence on Japanese culture remains profound and pervasive. The values of loyalty, discipline, and dedication to one's duties that were originally developed by the warrior class continue to shape Japanese attitudes toward work, education, and social relationships. The aesthetic sensibilities that were cultivated by samurai patrons of the arts continue to influence Japanese literature, theatre, and visual arts. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai legacy continues to provide a source of cultural identity and national pride for the Japanese people. In a rapidly changing world where traditional values and customs are constantly under pressure from global cultural forces, the samurai represent a connection to a uniquely Japanese way of life that remained distinctive and independent despite centuries of foreign influence and internal change. The story of the samurai is ultimately a story about the relationship between tradition and change, about how human societies adapt to new circumstances while preserving what they value most about their cultural heritage. The samurai class successfully reinvented itself multiple times over the course of its 1,000-year history, transforming from provincial warriors into court nobles, from court nobles into feudal administrators, from feudal administrators into modern bureaucrats and military officers. Each of these transformations required the samurai to abandon some aspects of their traditional identity while preserving others. They gave up their monopoly on military service, but retained their commitment to discipline and loyalty. They abandoned their hereditary privileges, but preserved their sense of duty and responsibility. They embraced foreign technology and ideas, but maintained their distinctive cultural values and aesthetic sensibilities. This process of selective adaptation allowed the samurai class to remain relevant and influential long after the military and political circumstances that had originally given birth to it had disappeared. It also demonstrates the remarkable flexibility and resilience of Japanese culture more generally, its ability to absorb foreign influences while maintaining its essential character and identity. The samurai were never just warriors. They were the carriers of a complex cultural tradition that encompassed not only military skills but also administrative competence, artistic sensibility, and philosophical wisdom. They were poets as well as fighters, scholars as well as soldiers, patrons of the arts as well as masters of warfare. This multifaceted character allowed them to find new roles and purposes even when their original military function became obsolete. The greatest samurai were those who understood that true strength comes not from rigid adherence to unchanging traditions, but from the wisdom to know when and how to adapt those traditions to new circumstances. Figures like Minamoto no Yoritomo, who created new forms of government, Miyamoto Musashi, who developed new approaches to strategy and combat, and the Meiji-era reformers who sacrificed their own class privileges for the good of the nation all demonstrated this kind of adaptive wisdom. Their legacy reminds us that the most important human values, loyalty, courage, honour, and the pursuit of excellence, are not dependent on any particular social or political system but can find expression in many different contexts. The samurai showed that it is possible to maintain one's essential identity while adapting to radically changed circumstances, and that tradition and innovation need not be enemies, but can work together to create new forms of human flourishing. In our own time, as we struggle to balance the demands of technological progress with the need to preserve human values and cultural traditions, the example of the samurai offers both inspiration and practical wisdom. They show us that change is not only inevitable, but can be channeled in positive directions through thoughtful leadership and a commitment to the highest human ideals. The story that began in the rice paddies of ancient Japan and ended in the modern offices of Meiji-era Tokyo is ultimately a story about the human capacity for growth and transformation. It reminds us that no social class or cultural tradition is permanent, but that the values and ideals they embody can survive and flourish in new forms if they speak to fundamental human needs and aspirations. The samurai are gone, but their legacy lives on in the modern Japanese commitment to excellence, their devotion to continuous learning and self-improvement, their respect for tradition combined with openness to innovation. In this sense, every Japanese who strives to balance personal honour with social responsibility, who combines respect for the past with adaptation to the future, carries forward something of the samurai spirit. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that the greatest human achievements are not the products of any single generation or social class, but the result of centuries of accumulated wisdom, trial and error, and the gradual refinement of human values and institutions. The samurai were part of this larger human story, contributors to the endless project of creating more just, more beautiful, and more meaningful forms of human society. Their swords have been sheathed forever. Their armour hangs silent in museums, but their example continues to inspire anyone who believes that it is possible to live with honour in a complex world, to serve something greater than oneself, and to find beauty and meaning even in the face of inevitable change and loss. As we reach the end of our journey through 15 centuries of samurai history, we are left not with nostalgia for a vanished world, but with appreciation for the enduring human values that transcend any particular time or place. The samurai taught us that true strength comes from within, that honour is more valuable than life itself, and that the greatest victory is the conquest of one's own weaknesses and limitations. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago, reminding us that while the external forms of human society may change beyond recognition, the fundamental challenges of human existence, the struggle between duty and desire, the search for meaning and purpose, the need to balance individual fulfillment with social responsibility, remain constant across the centuries. But there are still stories to tell, still shadows to chase through the corridors of time. The samurai were not merely men, they were an entire universe of human possibility, and that universe contained multitudes we have barely begun to explore. Consider, for instance, the women who wielded the naginata with deadly grace, the Onabugeisha, female warriors who proved that courage and skill knew no gender boundaries, Tomoe Gozen, who fought beside Minamoto no Yoshinaka in the Genpei War, was said to be worth 1,000 ordinary warriors. Contemporary accounts describe her cutting through enemy ranks like a blade through silk, her horse dancing beneath her as she wielded both bow and sword with equal mastery. The chronicles tell us that at the final battle of Owazu, when defeat had become inevitable, Yoshinaka ordered Tomoe to flee rather than die uselessly in a lost cause. She obeyed, but not before taking the head of Onda no Hachiro Moroshige, a warrior renowned throughout the land, pulling him from his horse with her bare hands and ending his life with her short sword. The image of Tomoe, her armour spattered with blood, her hair streaming behind her as she rode toward an uncertain future, became one of the most enduring symbols of samurai valour. But Tomoe was not unique. Throughout the samurai period, women of the warrior class received training in martial arts, not as decoration or curiosity, but as a practical necessity. When the men rode off to war, someone had to defend the family compounds and protect the children. The naginata, with its long, curved blade mounted on a staff, became the preferred weapon of these female warriors, its reach and sweeping cuts perfectly suited to defending doorways and narrow passages. Nakano Takeko, who lived in the twilight years of the samurai era, represents the final flowering of this tradition. During the Boshin War of 1868, as imperial forces advanced on her home domain of Aizu, she organised a unit of female warriors to defend their homeland. At the Battle of Aizu, she fought with such ferocity that enemy soldiers initially mistook her for a demon. When a bullet finally brought her down, her dying wish was that her head be cut off and hidden, so that it could not be taken as a trophy by the victorious imperial forces. These women remind us that the samurai ideal was never exclusively masculine, despite the stories that have come down to us. The qualities that defined the warrior class, loyalty, courage, skill at arms, and willingness to die for one's principles, could manifest in anyone who possessed the necessary character and training. The patriarchal structure of Japanese society may have limited women's opportunities for public recognition, but it could not prevent them from embodying the highest samurai virtues when circumstances demanded it. The religious dimensions of samurai culture deserve deeper exploration as well, for they were far more complex and influential than our brief survey has suggested. The relationship between the warrior class and Buddhism, in particular, was one of the defining features of Japanese civilization for over a millennium. Yet this relationship was marked by constant tension and contradiction, as warriors struggled to reconcile their violent profession with a religion that preached compassion for all living beings. The solution they developed was both philosophically sophisticated and practically necessary. Rather than abandoning either their military duties or their religious beliefs, the samurai created new forms of Buddhism that emphasized the spiritual value of selfless action and the possibility of achieving enlightenment through perfect performance of one's social role. The way of the warrior became a path to salvation, with the battlefield serving as a monastery and combat as a form of meditation. This fusion of martial and spiritual values reached its highest expression in the tradition of warrior monks known as Sohei. These were not samurai who had taken religious vows, but rather Buddhist monks who had taken up arms to defend their temples and their faith. The great temple complexes of Nara and Mount Hiei maintained substantial military forces throughout the medieval period, and their warrior monks were among the most feared fighters in Japan. The Sohei represented a unique synthesis of religious devotion and martial prowess that had no real parallel in other Buddhist cultures. They fought with the fanatical courage of true believers, viewing their battles not as secular conflicts, but as holy wars against the forces of ignorance and evil. Their distinctive costume, the white robes of Buddhist monks combined with armour and weapons, became a symbol of the complex relationship between violence and spirituality that characterized much of Japanese history. Perhaps the most famous of these warrior monks was Benki, the legendary companion of Minamoto no Yoshitsune. According to the tales that grew up around him, Benki had been a giant of a man, standing over 7 feet tall and possessing strength that bordered on the supernatural. He had begun his career as a monk of the Enryakuji temple complex on Mount Hiei, but his violent temperament had made him unsuitable for conventional religious life. The story goes that Benki stationed himself on the Gojo Bridge in Kyoto, challenging passing warriors to single combat and collecting their swords as trophies. He had accumulated 999 blades in this manner when he encountered the young Yoshitsune, who was still travelling under his childhood name of Ushiwakamaru. Despite his enormous size advantage, Benki was defeated by the smaller warrior's superior speed and technique, and from that moment forward he became Yoshitsune's most devoted retainer. The friendship between Yoshitsune and Benkei became one of the great themes of Japanese literature, representing the ideal relationship between lord and vassal. Benkei's loyalty was absolute and unquestioning. He followed his master through victory and defeat, glory and exile, never wavering in his devotion even when it became clear that loyalty would mean death. At the final battle of Koromogawa, Benkei died standing upright, his body riddled with arrows, still guarding the entrance to the hall where Yoshitsune was preparing for his own end. Enemy soldiers were afraid to approach what they thought was a living warrior, not realizing that Benkei's spirit had been so strong that death itself could not make him abandon his post. The tale of Benkei's standing death became one of the most powerful symbols in Japanese culture, representing the samurai ideal of loyalty beyond death itself. It spoke to something deep in the Japanese psyche about the nature of duty and devotion, about the possibility of transcending human limitations through perfect fulfillment of one's obligations. Even today, the phrase Benkei no Tachi Ojo, Benkei's standing death, is used to describe any act of extraordinary determination or loyalty. But the religious life of the samurai was not limited to Buddhism. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, provided another crucial dimension of warrior spirituality. Unlike Buddhism, with its emphasis on transcending the material world, Shinto celebrated the sacredness of the natural world and the divine nature of the Japanese islands themselves. For the samurai, this meant that their role as defenders of Japan carried religious as well as political significance. The concept of the divine wind, or kamikaze, that saved Japan from the Mongol invasions became central to samurai self-understanding. Many warriors came to believe that Japan was under the special protection of the kami, the Shinto deities, and that their military service was a form of religious devotion. This belief would eventually evolve into the emperor worship that characterized Japanese nationalism in the modern period, but in its original form it was more subtle and complex. Shinto provided the samurai with a sense of sacred purpose that complemented the personal discipline they derived from Buddhism. If Buddhism taught them to accept death without fear, Shinto taught them that their deaths would serve a cosmic purpose, contributing to the defense of a land that was itself divine. This combination of personal detachment and sacred mission created a warrior mentality that was almost unique in world history. The influence of Confucianism on samurai culture was equally profound, though often overlooked in popular accounts. Confucian ideals of loyalty, filial piety, and social harmony provided the ethical framework within which samurai society operated. The complex hierarchies of the Tokugawa period, with their emphasis on knowing one's place and fulfilling one's assigned role, were fundamentally Confucian in inspiration. But the samurai adaptation of Confucianism was distinctively Japanese, emphasizing military virtues and personal honor in ways that would have surprised the original Chinese philosophers. The Confucian ideal of the scholar gentleman was transformed into the ideal of the scholar warrior, someone who combined learning with martial prowess and moral cultivation with practical effectiveness. This synthesis reached its highest expression in figures like Yamaga Soko, a 17th century samurai philosopher who developed the most systematic account of Bushido in the Tokugawa period. Yamaga argued that the samurai were the moral leaders of society, responsible not just for military defense, but for setting an example of ethical behavior for all other social classes. Their privileged position carried with it the obligation to cultivate themselves morally and intellectually, so that they could serve as proper models for the rest of society. Yamaga's teachings were influential in shaping the self-image of the Tokugawa-era samurai, but they also created new forms of anxiety and self-doubt. If the samurai were supposed to be moral paragons, what did it mean that many of them were struggling with debt, family problems, and the ordinary temptations of human life? The gap between the ideal and the reality created a sense of cultural crisis that would eventually contribute to the downfall of the Tokugawa system itself. The regional variations in samurai culture are another dimension that deserves more attention than our survey has allowed. While we often speak of the samurai as if they were a unified group with identical values and practices, the reality was much more diverse and complex. Each domain developed its own military traditions, its own interpretation of warrior ethics, and its own approach to the challenges of governance and administration. The Satsuma domain in southern Kyushu, for example, developed a particularly austere and militaristic form of samurai culture that emphasized physical toughness and group solidarity. Young samurai in Satsuma were organized into neighborhood groups called goju that combined military training with moral education and mutual surveillance. The harsh climate and frequent conflicts with the indigenous Kumaso people had created a warrior culture that was more egalitarian and pragmatic than in other parts of Japan. The Date domain in northern Honshu, by contrast, developed a more cosmopolitan and aesthetically sophisticated form of samurai culture under the leadership of Date Masamune and his successors. The Date samurai were known for their appreciation of foreign goods and ideas, their patronage of the arts, and their willingness to experiment with new technologies and techniques. Masamune himself had sent an embassy to Rome in the early 17th century, demonstrating an openness to foreign influence that was rare among his contemporaries. The Choshu domain in western Honshu developed yet another distinctive form of samurai culture, one that emphasized scholarly achievement and political activism. Choshu samurai were deeply influenced by Confucian learning and nationalist philosophy, and they played a crucial role in the intellectual movements that eventually led to the Meiji Restoration. Their combination of traditional warrior values with modern political ideas made them particularly effective in the complex political struggles of the late Tokugawa period. These regional differences remind us that the samurai class was never a monolithic entity, but rather a collection of local warrior elites who shared certain common values and practices while maintaining their own distinctive characteristics. The process by which these diverse groups were gradually unified under the Tokugawa system was one of the great administrative achievements of the early modern period, but it was never complete. Regional loyalties and traditions continued to influence samurai behavior throughout the Tokugawa era, and played an important role in the political upheavals of the 19th century. The daily life of the samurai in different periods also reveals fascinating patterns of continuity and change. During the Kamakura period, when most samurai were still primarily warriors, their lives revolved around the cycles of training, campaign, and garrison duty. A typical samurai might spend months preparing for war, weeks or months in actual combat, and then years in relative peace, administering his lands and training his sons in the military arts. The training regimen was rigorous and comprehensive, encompassing not just weapons practice but also horsemanship, archery, strategy, and the various cultural accomplishments that were expected of a warrior gentleman. A young samurai would begin his education as early as age 5, starting with the basics of swordsmanship and gradually progressing to more advanced techniques as he matured. By the time he reached adulthood, he would be expected to master at least the 18 martial arts, a traditional curriculum that included everything from swimming in armour to conducting siege warfare. The Tokugawa period brought dramatic changes to this pattern of life. With the establishment of lasting peace, most samurai found themselves serving as administrators rather than warriors. Their daily routines came to resemble those of modern civil servants more than medieval knights. They spent their time in offices rather than training grounds, wielding brushes rather than swords, and dealing with budget reports rather than enemy armies. Yet the forms and symbols of warrior life were carefully preserved, even when their practical significance had disappeared. Samurai continued to wear their 2 swords, even though they rarely used them. They continued to practice martial arts, even though these skills were no longer militarily relevant. They continued to study military strategy and tactics, even though there were no wars to fight. This preservation of warrior forms in a peaceful context created a unique culture that combined practical administrative competence with romantic warrior idealism. The economic life of the samurai also underwent significant transformation over time. During the early periods, most samurai derived their income directly from agricultural land, either as small independent farmers or as estate managers for larger landowners. They understood the rhythms of rural life, knew the concerns of peasant cultivators, and were intimately connected to the economic realities of agricultural production. The Tokugawa system changed this relationship fundamentally by requiring samurai to live in castle towns rather than on their lands. Most samurai became dependent on fixed stipends paid by their daimyo lords, cutting them off from direct involvement in agricultural production. This change had profound cultural consequences as the samurai class became increasingly urbanized and removed from the rural roots that had originally sustained it. The fixed nature of these stipends created chronic financial problems for many samurai families. While merchants and artisans could increase their incomes by expanding their businesses or developing new products, samurai incomes remained static, even as prices rose and economic opportunities expanded. Many samurai found themselves forced to borrow money from the very merchants they looked down upon, creating a complex web of economic relationships that undermined the traditional social hierarchy. Some samurai responded to these economic pressures by engaging in commercial activities themselves, despite official prohibitions against such behavior. They became silent partners in merchant enterprises, invested in manufacturing operations, or used their literacy and administrative skills to work as accountants or clerks for commercial firms. These activities were technically illegal and socially shameful, but they were often the only way for samurai families to maintain their standard of living. The involvement of samurai in commercial activities had important cultural consequences, as it brought them into direct contact with the practical realities of economic life that their traditional education had largely ignored. Many samurai discovered that they had much to learn from the merchants they had previously despised, and some began to question whether the rigid social hierarchy of the Tokugawa system was really beneficial for Japanese society as a whole. The artistic and literary achievements of the samurai class deserve more extended treatment than our survey has provided. The combination of martial discipline with aesthetic sensitivity that characterized samurai culture produced some of the greatest masterpieces in Japanese art and literature. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry, and other cultural arts reached unprecedented heights of refinement under samurai patronage and participation. The relationship between the samurai and the tea ceremony is particularly interesting, as it represents the ultimate expression of the warrior's quest for spiritual discipline and aesthetic perfection. The tea ceremony required the same kind of mental focus and attention to detail that characterized good swordsmanship, but it channeled these qualities toward entirely peaceful ends. The samurai who practiced tea ceremony were not abandoning their warrior nature, but rather expressing it in a different form. The greatest tea master in Japanese history, Sen no Rikyu, exemplified this fusion of warrior and aesthetic values. Rikyu served as tea master to both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, two of the most powerful and violent men of their age, but he maintained his artistic integrity even when it brought him into conflict with his patrons. When Hideyoshi ordered him to commit seppuku over a political disagreement, Rikyu approached his death with the same calm precision that he had brought to the tea ceremony, treating his final moments as the ultimate expression of his artistic philosophy. The influence of the samurai on Japanese poetry was equally profound. The classical forms of Japanese verse, particularly the tanka and haiku, were shaped by samurai sensibilities and values. The emphasis on capturing a moment of intense emotion or perception in a few carefully chosen words reflected the warrior's training in making quick, decisive judgments under pressure. The preference for understatement and suggestion over explicit description reflected the samurai aesthetic of restraint and self-control. Many of the greatest poets in Japanese history were samurai who used their verse to explore the tension between their martial duties and their human sensibilities. The poems they wrote on the eve of battle, or while contemplating the cherry blossoms that symbolized the brevity of life, achieved a depth of feeling and philosophical insight that would be difficult to match in any literary tradition. The visual arts also flourished under samurai influence, particularly the art of sword-making, which reached levels of technical and aesthetic perfection that have never been surpassed. A great Japanese sword was not merely a weapon, but a work of art, embodying the smith's understanding of metallurgy, his aesthetic sensibility, and his spiritual discipline. The process of forging a sword was surrounded by ritual and ceremony, and the finished product was regarded as possessing its own spiritual essence. The samurai's relationship with their swords was deeply personal and almost mystical. A warrior's sword was believed to contain part of his soul, and the loss or breakage of a family blade was considered a spiritual catastrophe as well as a practical disaster. The ceremonies surrounding the presentation of swords, their care and maintenance, and their eventual inheritance became central elements of samurai family life. The armour worn by samurai was similarly artistic, combining practical protection with aesthetic beauty in ways that reflected the wearer's status, wealth, and personal taste. The great armourers of the medieval period were considered artists as well as craftsmen, and their creations were passed down through generations as family treasures. The elaborate helmet ornaments, the intricate lacing patterns, and the careful attention to colour and proportion all served to transform the samurai warrior into a figure of almost supernatural presence on the battlefield. But perhaps the most important artistic achievement of the samurai class was the development of a distinctive aesthetic philosophy that continues to influence Japanese culture to this day. This philosophy emphasized simplicity over complexity, natural materials over artificial ones, and subtle beauty over obvious display. It preferred the weathered and imperfect to the polished and perfect, finding beauty in signs of age and use rather than in pristine newness. This aesthetic philosophy was perfectly suited to the samurai worldview, with its emphasis on accepting impermanence and finding meaning in transient experiences. The cherry blossom became the ultimate symbol of samurai values precisely because its beauty was so brief and fragile, blooming magnificently for a few days before falling to the ground. The samurai who could appreciate this beauty without trying to preserve it permanently had achieved a form of spiritual wisdom that transcended ordinary human attachments. The influence of this aesthetic philosophy extended far beyond the samurai class itself, shaping everything from garden design to architectural principles to the arrangement of objects in daily life. The Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection and impermanence, can be traced directly to the spiritual disciplines that samurai developed to cope with the uncertainty and violence of their lives. The decline and fall of the samurai class involved not just political and economic changes, but also a profound cultural transformation that affected every aspect of Japanese society. The values and practices that had sustained the warrior class for centuries suddenly seemed obsolete and even counterproductive in a world dominated by Western technology and international competition. Yet the process of abandoning these traditional values was neither quick nor easy, and it created traumas that reverberated through Japanese culture for generations. The individual stories of samurai who lived through this transition are often heartbreaking in their portrayal of men and women struggling to maintain their dignity and identity in a rapidly changing world. Some, like Katsukaishu, successfully adapted to the new circumstances and played important roles in the modernization process. Katsu was a Tokugawa retainer who became one of the leading advocates of naval modernization and Western learning, eventually serving in high positions in the Meiji government despite his former allegiance to the shogunate. Others, like Enomoto Takeaki, attempted to preserve the old order through armed resistance, only to discover that their traditional military skills were no match for modern weapons and tactics. Enomoto led the last remnant of the Tokugawa Navy to Hokkaido, where he attempted to establish an independent republic based on traditional samurai values. The experiment lasted less than a year before being crushed by imperial forces, but it represented a poignant attempt to create a space where the old ways could continue to flourish. Still others, like the participants in various samurai rebellions of the 1870s, chose to die rather than accept the destruction of their traditional way of life. These men were not simply conservatives clinging to outdated privileges. They were people whose entire sense of identity and purpose had been bound up with a social system that was being systematically dismantled. Their resistance was as much existential as political, an assertion that some values were worth dying for even when they could no longer be practically maintained. The most famous of these resistance movements was the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigo Takamori, who had ironically been one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration itself. Saigo's journey from revolutionary hero to reactionary rebel illustrates the complex dynamics of the transition period. He had supported the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate because he believed it would restore true imperial rule and preserve traditional Japanese values. When it became clear that the new government was more interested in Western-style modernization than in traditional restoration, he felt betrayed and eventually took up arms against his former allies. The final battle of the Satsuma Rebellion, fought at Shirayama in September 1877, marked the definitive end of the samurai as a military force. Saigo and his few remaining followers, armed with swords and spears, charged against imperial troops equipped with modern rifles and artillery. The outcome was never in doubt, but the symbolic significance of the battle was enormous. The last great samurai leader died as he had lived, sword in hand, faithful to his principles even in the face of inevitable defeat. Yet even as the samurai class was being eliminated as a social and political force, its influence on Japanese culture was being preserved and transformed in new ways. The Meiji government, despite its commitment to modernization, recognized the value of samurai traditions and sought to incorporate them into the new national ideology. The emperor system that emerged in the late 19th century drew heavily on samurai concepts of loyalty and service. while the modern Japanese military adopted many samurai customs and values. The process by which samurai values were democratized and nationalized is one of the most interesting aspects of modern Japanese history. Concepts like loyalty to the emperor, willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, and the importance of maintaining face and honor that had originally been the exclusive property of the warrior class were gradually extended to the entire population. Every Japanese citizen was expected to embody the samurai virtues of discipline, courage, and selflessness in service to the state. This democratization of samurai values had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it helped to create a sense of national unity and purpose that enabled Japan to modernize rapidly and resist Western domination. The work ethic, educational achievement, and social cohesion that characterized modern Japan can all be traced in part to the influence of samurai ideals on the broader population. On the negative side, the militarization of samurai values contributed to the aggressive nationalism and imperialism that eventually led Japan into World War II. The concepts of honor and loyalty that had originally served to regulate behavior within a feudal hierarchy were transformed into justifications for conquest and expansion. The willingness to die for one's lord became a willingness to die for the emperor and the Japanese race, while the code of honor that had emphasized personal virtue became a tool for enforcing conformity and suppressing dissent. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 marked the final end of the military values that had grown out of the samurai tradition. The utter devastation caused by these weapons made it impossible to maintain the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, or that death in battle was inherently meaningful and glorious. The Japan that emerged from defeat was forced to construct new values and new forms of identity that did not depend on military strength or imperial expansion. Yet even in defeat, certain elements of the samurai tradition proved surprisingly durable. The emphasis on group loyalty, personal discipline, and continuous self-improvement that had characterized the warrior class found new expression in the corporate culture of post-war Japan. The lifetime employment system, with its emphasis on loyalty between employers and employees, resembled nothing so much as the feudal relationships that had bound samurai to their lords. The quality control circles and other participatory management techniques that made Japanese manufacturing so successful in the post-war period drew on traditional concepts of group solidarity and collective responsibility. The aesthetic values of the samurai also survived the transition to modernity, continuing to influence Japanese art, architecture, and design. The preference for natural materials, the appreciation of subtle beauty, and the acceptance of impermanence that characterized samurai culture became central elements of modern Japanese style. The gardens, buildings, and manufactured goods that made Japan famous throughout the world in the late 20th century all bore the unmistakable influence of aesthetic principles that had been developed centuries earlier by the warrior class. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai tradition provided modern Japan with a sense of cultural continuity and national identity that proved invaluable during the rapid changes of the modern period. Even as they embraced Western technology and international integration, the Japanese people could maintain their sense of distinctiveness and pride by referring back to the achievements and values of their warrior ancestors. The samurai became symbols of everything that was unique and admirable about Japanese culture, representing a form of nobility and excellence that could not be reduced to material success or technological achievement. This process of cultural preservation through symbolic transformation is one of the most remarkable aspects of Japanese modernization. Rather than simply abandoning their traditional culture in favor of Western alternatives, the Japanese found ways to reinterpret and adapt their heritage to new circumstances. The samurai provided a particularly rich source of symbols and values for this process, since their tradition combined practical effectiveness with spiritual depth in ways that could speak to the needs of modern people. The contemporary Japanese fascination with samurai culture, evident in everything from popular movies to martial arts schools to corporate training programs, reflects this ongoing process of cultural adaptation and reinterpretation. Each generation of Japanese has found new ways to understand and apply the samurai legacy, discovering new meanings and possibilities in traditions that might otherwise have seemed obsolete and irrelevant. For those of us outside Japan, the samurai tradition offers equally valuable insights into the possibilities and limitations of human culture. The story of the samurai reminds us that no social system or set of values is permanent, but it also shows us how the best elements of any tradition can survive and flourish, even under radically changed circumstances. The warrior who becomes a poet, the fighter who becomes a philosopher, the destroyer who becomes a creator. These transformations represent some of the highest possibilities of human development. The samurai were never perfect, and their society was never without its cruelties and injustices. The rigid social hierarchy that sustained them also oppressed millions of peasants and merchants who had no hope of advancement or recognition. The warrior values that produced great art and literature also led to countless acts of violence and brutality. The aesthetic refinement that we admire today was built on a foundation of human suffering that we cannot ignore or romanticize. Yet for all their flaws and contradictions, the samurai achieved something remarkable. They created a form of human excellence that combined physical prowess, intellectual sophistication, artistic sensitivity, and spiritual depth in ways that few other cultures have managed to match. They showed that it was possible to live with honor and dignity even in the most difficult circumstances, to find beauty and meaning even in the face of violence and death, and to maintain one's humanity even while performing the most brutal duties. These achievements did not come easily or without cost. They required generations of effort and sacrifice, countless individual tragedies and triumphs, and the gradual accumulation of wisdom through trial and error. The samurai tradition that we admire today was not the product of any single genius or revelation, but the result of centuries of human effort to create better ways of living and being in the world. In our own time, as we face challenges that are both similar to and different from those confronted by the samurai, we can draw inspiration from their example without trying to imitate their specific practices or institutions. We can learn from their discipline without accepting their authoritarianism, from their loyalty without embracing their exclusivity, from their aesthetic sensitivity without adopting their social rigidity. Most importantly, we can learn from their fundamental insight that human excellence is not a destination, but a journey, not a fixed achievement, but an ongoing process of growth and development. The greatest samurai were those who understood that mastery of any art or skill was not an end in itself, but a means to the larger goal of becoming fully human. They sought perfection not for its own sake, but as a way of serving something greater than themselves. This understanding of excellence as service, of skill as a form of moral development, and of individual achievement as a contribution to the common good, remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. In our own struggles to balance personal fulfillment with social responsibility, to maintain our humanity in an increasingly technological world, and to find meaning and purpose in rapidly changing circumstances, we can still learn from the example of warriors who face similar challenges with courage, wisdom, and grace. The swords are silent now, the armor rusts in museums, and the castles stand empty against the sky. But the spirit that animated the samurai, the quest for excellence, the commitment to honor, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself, lives on in everyone who refuses to accept mediocrity as sufficient, who believes that how we live matters as much as what we achieve, and who understands that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from mastering ourselves. In the end, this may be the most important lesson of all, that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields but in the human heart, not through the conquest of enemies but through the conquest of our own limitations and weaknesses. The samurai knew this truth, lived it imperfectly but sincerely, and passed it on to us across the centuries. Whether we choose to accept and honour this legacy is now up to us. As our journey through 15 centuries of samurai history draws to its close, we are left not with answers but with questions, not with certainties but with possibilities. The samurai story is ultimately our story, the human story of the eternal struggle between what we are and what we might become. It reminds us that we are all warriors in our own way, fighting our own battles against ignorance, selfishness, and despair, seeking our own forms of honour and meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to our efforts. The samurai would tell us that this struggle is itself the meaning, that the seeking is more important than the finding, and that how we conduct ourselves in this eternal battle determines everything about who we are and who we might become. They would remind us that excellence is not a gift but a choice, that honour is not inherited but earned, and that the only defeat that truly matters is the defeat that comes from giving up on our highest possibilities. So let us take our leave of these ancient warriors with gratitude for their example, and determination to apply their lessons in our own lives. let us remember that we too are capable of greatness, not in spite of our limitations and imperfections, but because of our willingness to struggle against them. And let us never forget that the true measure of any life is not its length or its comfort, but the courage and grace with which it is lived. The way of the warrior is eternal, not because it belongs to any particular time or place, but because it speaks to the deepest and best possibilities of the human spirit. As long as there are people who refuse to accept that good enough is good enough, who believe that beauty and truth and justice are worth fighting for, and who understand that how we live matters more than how long we live, the samurai legacy will endure. And in that endurance, perhaps, lies whatever immortality any of us can hope to achieve. Yet there are still more threads to follow through this vast tapestry, still more voices calling to us from the shadows of history. The samurai were not just warriors and administrators, artists and philosophers. They were also storytellers, and the stories they told about themselves shaped not only their own understanding of their purpose, but the very soul of Japanese civilization. Consider the extraordinary influence of the military epics that emerged from the samurai experience. The tale of the Heike, which we have touched upon, was not merely a historical chronicle, but a profound meditation on the nature of power, the inevitability of change, and the Buddhist concept of impermanence. Its opening lines, known to virtually every educated Japanese person even today, speak of the transience of all earthly glory. The sound of the Gion. Shoja bells echoes the impermanence of all things. The colour of the sala flowers reveals the truth that the prosperous must decline. These words, written in the aftermath of the Genpei War, established a template for understanding historical change that would influence Japanese thinking for centuries. The Taira clan's fall from the heights of power to destruction in the waves at Danoyura became a metaphor for the fate that awaits all who become too attached to worldly success. Yet the tale also celebrated the beauty and nobility that could emerge from tragedy, finding in the Taira's destruction a kind of aesthetic perfection that transcended mere political defeat. The influence of such epics extended far beyond literature into the realm of popular culture and collective memory. Travelling storytellers carried these tales to every corner of Japan, performing them in temples and marketplaces, adapting them for local audiences while preserving their essential themes. The stories became part of the mental furniture of Japanese civilization, providing frameworks for understanding everything from personal misfortune to national catastrophe. The samurai themselves were deeply influenced by these literary creations, which provided them with models of heroic behaviour and tragic nobility. Young warriors would memorize passages from the great epics, using them as guides for their own conduct in battle and in life. The line between literature and reality became blurred, as samurai sought to live up to the ideals embodied in the stories, while the stories themselves were constantly enriched by new examples of heroic behaviour. This dynamic relationship between literature and life created a uniquely Japanese form of cultural development, in which artistic creation and social reality reinforced each other in complex ways. The samurai created the literature that celebrated their values, but they were also shaped by that literature in return. The result was a culture of extraordinary aesthetic sophistication, combined with fierce martial discipline, a combination that has few parallels in world history. The role of the samurai in shaping the Japanese language itself deserves particular attention. The warrior class was responsible for developing much of the vocabulary and many of the linguistic conventions that continue to characterize Japanese speech today. The complex system of honorific language, with its elaborate distinctions between different levels of social hierarchy, was largely a product of samurai court culture. The preference for indirect expression and subtle implication over direct statement reflected the samurai's training in reading tactical situations and understanding unspoken communications. Even the physical gestures and bodily postures that are considered typically Japanese can be traced back to samurai influence. The deep bow, the controlled facial expressions, the careful attention to spatial relationships, all of these reflect the warrior's training in showing respect, maintaining dignity, and projecting appropriate authority. The samurai understanding of the body as both weapon and instrument of communication created patterns of nonverbal behaviour that continue to influence Japanese social interaction today. The interaction between samurai and the other social classes provides another rich vein of historical material that illuminates the complexity of Japanese society. While the official ideology of the Tokugawa period insisted on rigid separation between warriors, farmers, artisans, and merchants, the reality was far more fluid and complex. Samurai families often intermarried with wealthy merchant families, creating networks of relationship that crossed class boundaries. Ronin, masterless samurai, frequently found employment as teachers, bodyguards, or administrators for merchant houses, bringing their skills and education into direct contact with commercial culture. The relationship between samurai and farmers was particularly complex, since many samurai families had themselves emerged from the farming class in earlier periods. The separation of warriors and farmers that was formalized under Hideyoshi and maintained under the Tokugawa was in many ways artificial, cutting connections that had existed for centuries. Yet this separation also created new forms of tension and mutual dependence. As samurai became increasingly dependent on agricultural production, they no longer directly controlled, while farmers chafed under the authority of warriors who no longer shared their daily struggles. The cultural exchange that occurred despite official class boundaries was enormously important for Japanese development. Samurai literacy and educational traditions influenced the remarkable growth of popular education during the Tokugawa period, while merchant pragmatism and commercial innovation influenced samurai approaches to domain administration and economic policy. The result was a society that combined elements of feudal hierarchy with early modern efficiency in ways that facilitated Japan's rapid modernization in the 19th century. The technological evolution that occurred within samurai culture is another fascinating dimension of their history. The introduction of firearms in the 16th century forced a complete rethinking of traditional military tactics and defensive strategies. Castles that had been designed to withstand attacks by foot soldiers and mounted archers had to be rebuilt to resist cannon fire. Army formations that had emphasized individual combat between mounted warriors had to be reorganized around disciplined infantry units armed with muskets. The samurai adaptation to gunpowder weapons reveals both their pragmatic flexibility and their ability to preserve essential cultural values while adopting new technologies. Rather than simply abandoning their traditional weapons, they developed new fighting styles that combined swords and firearms in innovative ways. They created new ceremonies and rituals around the use of guns, treating them not as alien intrusions but as new expressions of traditional warrior values. The craftsmanship that went into samurai firearms was as elaborate and artistic as that which characterized their swords and armor. Gunsmiths decorated their weapons with the same attention to aesthetic detail that had always marked samurai equipment, creating firearms that were works of art as well as instruments of war. The ceremonies surrounding the cleaning, maintenance, and storage of firearms echoed those that had developed around traditional weapons, ensuring cultural continuity even in the midst of technological change. This pattern of adaptive preservation would characterize samurai responses to technological change throughout their history. When Western military advisors arrived in the 19th century with new ideas about army organization and training, many samurai embraced these innovations while maintaining their essential warrior identity. They learned to drill in European formations and use Western weapons while preserving their concepts of honor, loyalty, and martial discipline. The international perspective on the samurai adds yet another layer to their historical significance. European visitors to Japan, beginning with the Portuguese in the 16th century, were consistently impressed by the martial skills and cultural sophistication of the Japanese warrior class. The Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier wrote admiringly of samurai courage and discipline, while later visitors praised their learning and aesthetic sensibility. These foreign observations provide valuable outside perspectives on samurai culture, highlighting aspects that might have seemed natural and unremarkable to Japanese observers. European visitors were particularly struck by the combination of martial ferocity and cultural refinement that characterized the samurai, a combination that seemed almost incomprehensible to people raised in societies where military and cultural elites were more clearly separated. The influence flowed in both directions, as samurai leaders like Date Masamune and Hosokawa Tadaoki showed considerable interest in European technology, religion, and culture. Some samurai converted to Christianity, finding in the new religion spiritual resources that complemented their traditional training in Buddhism and Confucianism. Others became students of European military science, adapting Western techniques to Japanese conditions and creating hybrid forms of warfare that combined the best of both traditions. The eventual closing of Japan to foreign influence under the Tokugawa shogunate cut short these early experiments in cultural exchange, but they left lasting marks on samurai culture. The knowledge that there were other ways of organizing society and conducting warfare remained available to educated samurai throughout the Tokugawa period, providing intellectual resources that would prove crucial during the crisis of the 19th century. When Japan was finally forced to reopen to the outside world in the 1850s, many samurai were better prepared for the encounter with Western civilization than might have been expected after 2 centuries of isolation. Their traditional emphasis on learning and self-improvement, combined with their pragmatic approach to adopting useful innovations, enabled them to master Western military and administrative techniques with remarkable speed. The process by which individual samurai navigated the transition from feudalism to modernity deserves more detailed examination, as it reveals both the personal costs of historical change and the remarkable adaptability of human beings faced with the collapse of their familiar world. Consider the case of Katsu Kaishu, whom we mentioned briefly earlier. Born into a low-ranking samurai family in Edo, Katsu spent his early years in the traditional manner, studying classical Chinese literature and practicing swordsmanship. But he also became interested in Dutch learning, teaching himself to read European texts on navigation and military science. When the arrival of Perry's ships made Western knowledge suddenly valuable, Katsu found himself appointed to positions of increasing responsibility in the shogunal navy. He travelled to the United States as part of the first official Japanese embassy, experiencing Western society firsthand and developing a sophisticated understanding of international politics. When the Meiji Restoration occurred, he was able to transfer his loyalty to the new government and continue his career as a naval administrator and political leader. Katsu's story illustrates the possibilities available to samurai who were willing and able to adapt to changing circumstances. But his success was not achieved without cost. He had to abandon many of the assumptions and values that had shaped his early life, accepting that Western techniques were superior to traditional Japanese methods in many areas. He had to work with people from backgrounds that would previously have been considered beneath his notice, and he had to participate in the dismantling of the very system that had given his life meaning and structure. The psychological strain of such adaptation was enormous, and not everyone who attempted it was successful. Many samurai found themselves unable to bridge the gap between their traditional identity and the demands of the modern world. Some retreated into nostalgia, spending their later years trying to preserve and perpetuate customs and practices that no longer had any practical relevance. Others fell into despair, finding no way to maintain their sense of purpose and dignity in a world that seemed to have no place for their particular combination of skills and values. The stories of individual adaptation and failure during the Meiji period reveal the human dimension of historical change in ways that broader political and economic analyses cannot capture. Each samurai family faced its own unique set of challenges and opportunities, and the decisions they made shaped not only their own fate, but the development of modern Japanese society as a whole. Some of the most poignant stories involve samurai who attempted to preserve traditional values while adapting to modern circumstances, often with tragic results. Nogi Maresuke, who served as a general in the Russo-Japanese War and later as president of the elite Gakushuin school, exemplified both the possibilities and the limitations of this approach. Nogi successfully adapted traditional concepts of loyalty and self-sacrifice to modern military service, earning international recognition for his tactical skill and personal courage. But Nogi never fully reconciled himself to the changes that modernity brought to Japanese society. When Emperor Meiji died in 1912, Nogi and his wife committed ritual suicide, choosing to follow their sovereign in death according to ancient custom. Their act shocked the modern world, but also provided a powerful symbol of the continuing influence of traditional values on Japanese life. Nogi's suicide represented both the ultimate expression of samurai loyalty and the final acknowledgement that the world that had given birth to such values had passed away forever. The influence of the samurai on Japanese educational development deserves particular attention, as it represents one of the most positive aspects of their legacy. The Tokugawa period saw an unprecedented expansion of literacy and learning, much of it driven by samurai values and initiatives. The teirakoya, or temple schools that provided basic education to children of all social classes, were often founded and operated by samurai who had received classical educations, but found themselves without traditional employment opportunities. These samurai educators brought to their teaching a combination of rigorous discipline and profound respect for learning that helped create one of the most educated populations in the pre-modern world. They emphasized not just practical skills like reading and arithmetic, but also moral development and character formation, treating education as a form of spiritual discipline rather than mere vocational training. The curriculum they developed combined traditional Chinese and Japanese classics with practical subjects like geography, natural science, and commercial mathematics. This combination of classical learning and practical skills proved invaluable when Japan entered the modern world, providing the educational foundation that enabled rapid industrialization and technological development. The samurai approach to education also emphasized the importance of continuous learning throughout life, a concept that would become central to modern Japanese culture. The warrior's traditional commitment to perfecting his skills through constant practice was extended to intellectual and cultural pursuits, creating an expectation that educated people would never stop learning and growing. This educational legacy helps explain why Japan was able to modernize so rapidly in the late 19th century. The country already possessed a large population of literate, disciplined people who were accustomed to learning new skills and adapting to changing circumstances. The samurai educators of the Tokugawa period had created the human resources that made Japanese modernization possible. The aesthetic dimensions of samurai culture continued to evolve and find new expressions throughout the modern period. The principles of design and craftsmanship that had been developed in the creation of swords, armor, and other military equipment were applied to civilian products, helping to create the distinctive Japanese approach to industrial design that would eventually make Japanese goods famous throughout the world. The attention to detail, the preference for natural materials, and the pursuit of functional perfection that characterized samurai aesthetic philosophy proved remarkably well suited to modern manufacturing. Japanese companies that achieved international success in the 20th century often explicitly drew on traditional craft principles in developing their products and production methods. The Toyota production system, with its emphasis on continuous improvement and elimination of waste, can be traced directly to traditional Japanese craft principles that had been refined over centuries of samurai patronage. The concept of kaizen, or continuous improvement, reflects the samurai belief that mastery is not a destination but a journey, requiring constant effort and attention to detail. Similarly, the Japanese approach to customer service, with its emphasis on anticipating needs and exceeding expectations, reflects traditional concepts of service and loyalty that had been developed in the context of feudal relationships. The modern Japanese businessman who takes pride in serving his customers with complete dedication is following a path that was first traced by samurai retainers serving their lords. The influence of samurai culture on modern Japanese business practices extends beyond specific techniques and philosophies to encompass fundamental attitudes toward work and achievement. The concept of lifetime employment, which characterized many Japanese companies throughout the post-war period, reflects traditional notions of mutual loyalty and obligation between superiors and subordinates. The emphasis on group harmony and consensus decision-making draws on traditional military concepts of unit cohesion and collective responsibility. Even the hierarchical structure of Japanese corporations, with their complex systems of seniority and deference, echoes the elaborate social hierarchies that characterize samurai society. While these traditional patterns have been modified and adapted to meet modern needs, their influence on Japanese organizational culture remains profound and pervasive. The international spread of Japanese martial arts in the modern period represents another important dimension of the samurai legacy. Judo, karate, aikido, and other disciplines that originated in the samurai tradition have found practitioners throughout the world, carrying with them not just physical techniques but also philosophical and spiritual teachings. The popularity of these martial arts reflects something deeper than mere interest in self-defense or physical fitness. They offer modern people access to forms of mental and spiritual discipline that have been tested and refined over centuries. The dojo, or training hall, becomes a place where traditional values of respect, perseverance, and self-improvement can be practiced and internalized, even in societies that are otherwise thoroughly modern and secular. The martial arts also provide a bridge between different cultures, allowing people from diverse backgrounds to share in the wisdom and discipline that the samurai developed. A businessman practicing Aikido in New York or a student learning Kendo in London is participating in a tradition that stretches back through centuries of Japanese history, connecting them to a way of understanding human potential and personal development that transcends cultural boundaries. The literary and cinematic treatment of the samurai in modern times has created a global awareness of their culture and values that extends far beyond Japan itself. Films like those of Akira Kurosawa and novels like those of Eiji Yoshikawa have introduced audiences around the world to the complex moral and philosophical issues that the samurai faced. These artistic works have helped establish the samurai as universal symbols of honor, courage, and the pursuit of excellence. But the popular image of the samurai that has emerged through these cultural products is not always historically accurate or complete. The romantic idealization that characterizes much modern treatment of samurai culture tends to emphasize their more admirable qualities, while downplaying or ignoring their participation in systems of oppression and violence. The challenge for modern audiences is to appreciate the genuine achievements of samurai culture, while maintaining a critical awareness of its limitations and contradictions. The historical reality of the samurai was far more complex and ambiguous than most popular representations suggest. They were capable of great nobility and terrible cruelty, sometimes within the same individual. They created beautiful art and literature while participating in systems that denied basic human rights to millions of people. They developed sophisticated ethical codes while engaging in warfare that caused immense suffering. This complexity is not a flaw in samurai culture, but rather a reflection of the fundamental contradictions that characterize all human societies. The samurai were products of their time and circumstances, shaped by the same mixture of idealism and pragmatism, wisdom and ignorance, compassion and selfishness that affects all human beings. What makes them remarkable is not their perfection, but their persistent effort to transcend their limitations and achieve something approaching moral and aesthetic excellence. The philosophical traditions that emerge from samurai culture continue to offer valuable insights for contemporary life, but only if we approach them with appropriate sophistication and critical awareness. The concept of Bushido, for example, can provide useful guidance for modern ethical decision-making, but only if we understand it as a human creation, rather than a divine revelation, subject to interpretation and modification as circumstances change. The samurai emphasis on loyalty and service remains relevant in a world where many people struggle to find meaning and purpose in their work and relationships. But this loyalty must be intelligently directed toward worthy objects rather than blindly given to any authority that demands it. The samurai understanding of courage and honor can inspire modern people to stand up for their principles, but it must be tempered by wisdom and compassion to avoid the destructive fanaticism that sometimes characterized historical samurai behavior. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai example of continuous self-improvement and pursuit of excellence offers a powerful alternative to the materialism and instant gratification that often characterize modern life. The samurai understood that true satisfaction comes not from acquiring things, but from developing one's capacities and character. They knew that mastery of any art or skill requires years of patient practice, and that the journey toward excellence is more important than any particular achievement along the way. This understanding remains as valuable today as it was centuries ago. In a world where technological change occurs at unprecedented speed, and where traditional forms of meaning and identity are constantly under pressure, the samurai example of finding purpose through disciplined pursuit of excellence offers a form of stability and direction that transcends particular circumstances. The samurai were ultimately teachers, whether they knew it or not. Through their successes and failures, their achievements and mistakes, they explored fundamental questions about how human beings should live and what values are worth preserving. They showed us both the possibilities and the limitations of warrior culture, both the heights of human excellence and the depths of human folly. Their greatest gift to us may be their demonstration that it is possible to maintain one's essential humanity and moral compass even in the most difficult circumstances. Whether facing death in battle, navigating complex political situations, or adapting to massive social change, the best of the samurai managed to preserve their integrity and dignity while remaining open to growth and transformation. This balance between steadfastness and flexibility, between loyalty to tradition and openness to innovation, between individual excellence and service to the common good, represents one of the highest achievements of human culture. It offers guidance not just for warriors or political leaders, but for anyone who seeks to live a meaningful and honorable life in a complex and often confusing world. As we contemplate the samurai legacy from our own historical perspective, we can see both how much has changed and how much remains constant in the human condition. The specific challenges that the samurai faced, the need to balance military effectiveness with moral principle, the challenge of adapting ancient traditions to new circumstances, the difficulty of maintaining personal integrity while serving larger purposes, continue to confront us in different forms. The technological and social changes of the modern period have been far more rapid and dramatic than anything the samurai experienced, but the fundamental questions they struggled with remain unchanged. How do we balance individual fulfillment with social responsibility? How do we maintain our humanity in systems that often seem to value efficiency over compassion? How do we find meaning and purpose in a world where traditional sources of guidance seem increasingly inadequate? The samurai cannot provide us with simple answers to these questions, but their example can inspire us to approach them with the same combination of courage, wisdom, and persistent effort that characterize their best representatives. They remind us that the pursuit of excellence is not a luxury or an indulgence, but a moral obligation, and that each of us has the capacity to contribute something valuable to the ongoing human project of creating more just, beautiful, and meaningful forms of life. In the end, the story of the samurai is our story, a chapter in the larger human narrative of struggle and achievement, failure and renewal, death and rebirth. They lived and died, loved and suffered, succeeded and failed much as we do today. What makes them worthy of our attention and respect is not their perfection, but their persistent effort to transcend their limitations and achieve something approaching greatness. Their legacy lives on not in museums or monuments, but in the choices we make each day about how to conduct ourselves in the world. Every time we choose courage over comfort, excellence over mediocrity, service over selfishness, we honour their memory and continue their work. Every time we refuse to accept that good enough is good enough, we prove that the warrior spirit they embodied is not dead but merely waiting for new forms of expression. The way of the warrior is the way of the fully realised human being, and that way remains open to all of us, regardless of our circumstances or social position. The samurai showed us what is possible when human beings commit themselves completely to the pursuit of excellence in service of something greater than themselves. Whether we choose to follow their example is up to us, and so we come full circle, back to the beginning where all true journeys end. The samurai are gone, but their spirit endures in everyone who understands that how we live matters more than how long we live, that honour is more valuable than safety, and that the greatest battles are fought not against external enemies, but against our own weaknesses and limitations. In honouring their memory, we honour the best possibilities of our own humanity. In learning from their example, we equip ourselves for our own battles, and in carrying forward their legacy of excellence and service, we ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain and that the values they fought to preserve will continue to inspire and guide future generations. The cherry blossoms that symbolize their understanding of life's beauty and fragility continue to bloom each spring, reminding us that even the briefest existence can achieve a kind of immortality through the beauty it creates and the example it provides. The samurai achieved such immortality not through conquest or accumulation, but through their dedication to ideals that transcend the limitations of any particular time or place. And in that dedication, perhaps, we can find the secret of whatever enduring significance our own lives might achieve. For in the end, we are all warriors in the service of something greater than ourselves, whether we call it honour, justice, beauty, truth, or love. The only question is whether we will fight our battles with the courage, wisdom, and grace that the samurai, at their best, exemplified. The choice, as always, is ours. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.